1006. Which of the following types of operations are excluded from the requirements in 14 CFR Part 107? A. Model aircraft for hobby use. B. Quadcopter capturing aerial imagery for crop monitoring. C. UAS used for motion picture filming. The correct answer is A. The Federal Aviation Regulations, 14 CFR Part 107, establish the rules for the operation of small unmanned aircraft systems, sUAS, for non-recreational purposes. However, certain operations are excluded from the requirements in Part 107. One of the excluded operations is model aircraft operated in accordance with Public Law 112-95, Section 336. This refers to the operation of model aircraft for hobby and recreational use, subject to certain safety guidelines established by Congress. 1007. Which of the following operations would be regulated by 14 CFR Part 107? A. Conducting public operations during a search mission. B. Flying for enjoyment with family and friends. C. Operating your sUAS for an imagery company. The correct answer is C. The Federal Aviation Regulations, 14 CFR Part 107, establish the rules for the operation of small unmanned aircraft systems, sUAS, for non-recreational purposes. Therefore, operating your sUAS for an imagery company. This operation is considered a commercial operation and is subject to the requirements in Part 107, unless an exemption or waiver has been obtained from the FAA. Conducting public operations during a search mission may be exempt from some of the requirements in Part 107, depending on the circumstances, but would generally be subject to other regulations and guidelines. Flying for enjoyment with family and friends would be subject to the registration and marking requirements in Part 48, but would not be subject to the requirements in Part 107, as long as the operation is conducted for hobby or recreational purposes only and complies with the safety guidelines established by Congress. 1008. As a remote pilot with an sUAS rating, under which situation can you deviate from 14 CFR Part 107? A. When conducting public operations during a search mission. B. Flying for enjoyment with family and friends. C. In response to an in-flight emergency. The correct answer is C. As a remote pilot with an sUAS rating, you may deviate from certain provisions of 14 CFR Part 107 in response to an in-flight emergency. Specifically, 14 CFR 107.205 allows a remote pilot to deviate from any rule in Part 107 in response to an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action. 1009. What action, if any, is appropriate if the remote pilot deviates from Part 107 during an emergency? A. Take no special action since you are pilot in command. B. File a detailed report to the FAA Administrator upon request. C. File a report to the FAA Administrator as soon as possible. The correct answer is C. According to 14 CFR Part 107, if a remote pilot deviates from the regulations in an emergency situation, they are required to submit a written report to the FAA Administrator explaining the deviation as soon as possible. The report must include the reason for the deviation, the nature of the deviation, and any remedial action taken to mitigate risks associated with the deviation. This requirement ensures that the FAA is aware of the circumstances surrounding the deviation and can take appropriate action if necessary to ensure safety. 1280. Which of these operations must comply with 14 CFR Part 107? A. Civil operations. B. Civil and public operations. C. Public and military operations. The correct answer is A. 14 CFR Part 107 applies to civil operations, which includes any operation conducted for business purposes or incidental to a business, such as aerial photography, surveying, or inspections. Public operations, which involve government agencies or organizations, may be subject to a different set of regulations under 14 CFR Part 91 or Part 137. Military operations, which involve the armed forces, are also subject to separate regulations.